What if the man who saved Europe was also the man too dangerous to control, and the decision that sidelined him forever was made not on a battlefield, but behind closed doors between two presidents who saw him very differently? In the spring and summer of 1945, the Second World War in Europe was drawing to its violent, exhausted close. The flags of victory had not yet dried, the smoke of the last battles still hung over the ruins of Germany, and already the men who had fought the war were being repositioned like pieces on a new board, one with entirely different rules. General George Smith Patton, Jr., the most feared American commander in the European theater, stood at the center of a storm that had nothing to do with German tanks or artillery. It had to do with power, politics, and the uncomfortable truth that warriors of his kind are celebrated in war and feared in peace. If this story has ever made you question what truly drives the decisions of great nations, stay right here. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with someone who loves real history, and drop a comment below telling us something you didn't know about Patton before today. Because what you are about to hear goes far deeper than the textbooks ever dared to tell. George Patton was not a man built for subtlety. He was born on November 11, 1885, in San Gabriel, California, into a family that breathed military tradition like other families breathed ordinary air. His grandfather had died fighting for the Confederacy in the Civil War. His great-uncle had served under Stonewall Jackson. From the time he could read, Patton devoured the accounts of Caesar, Napoleon, and Alexander the Great, not as history but as instruction. He believed, with absolute and unshakable certainty, that he had been a warrior in previous lives, that he had ridden with Hannibal across the Alps, that his soul was ancient and forged for combat. These were not the quiet beliefs of a reflective man. They were the fuel of a personality so enormous, so combustible, that even those who admired him most were often terrified by what he might do next. By the time World War II exploded across the European continent, Patton had already proven himself in North Africa, where his arrival at II Corps in March 1943 transformed a demoralized, defeated force into a fighting machine that would go on to shock the Germans in Tunisia. His performance in Sicily in the summer of 1943, commanding 7th Army, was nothing short of brilliant. A lightning campaign that captured Palermo and pushed eastward with a ferocity that left even his British counterparts breathless. But it was also in Sicily where the first great crisis of Patton's later career erupted. In August 1943, at two separate field hospitals, Patton slapped two soldiers he accused of cowardice. Men who were, in fact, suffering from what we now recognize as combat trauma. The incidents were witnessed. They were reported. And when the story reached General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander faced a decision that would define not just Patton's career, but the moral character of American military leadership. Eisenhower chose not to relieve Patton at that moment. He chose instead to issue a severe private reprimand, demand a formal apology to the men involved and to the units present, and suppress the story from public release, for a time. The decision was strategic. Eisenhower knew that Patton was a weapon, perhaps the most effective offensive commander the United States possessed, and the invasion of continental Europe still lay ahead. Losing Patton to public outrage over the slapping incidents would be, in Eisenhower's calculation, a greater cost than managing him. But managing Patton was never simple. When the story broke in November 1943, released by journalist Drew Pearson, the American public was outraged. Congress debated Patton's fitness for command. President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself was forced to weigh in, defending the decision to keep Patton in the theater while insisting that discipline would be maintained. Eisenhower stood firm. Patton would remain humiliated, sidelined, weaponized as a decoy during the lead-up to D-Day, but remain nonetheless. The use of Patton as a decoy in Operation Fortitude is one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of military deception. In the months before June 6, 1944, Allied intelligence crafted an elaborate false narrative designed to convince the German high command that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. And the most convincing element of that fiction was Patton himself. The Germans believed, with good reason, that the Americans would never launch their most critical operation without their finest commander at its head. So Patton was placed in command of a fictional army, the 1st United States Army Group, and he played the role with theatrical precision, appearing at public events, making speeches, deliberately letting himself be seen. Adolf Hitler and his generals held entire divisions at Pas-de-Calais for weeks after D-Day, waiting for Patton's real assault that never came. In a war defined by sacrifice, Patton's greatest contribution in the spring of 1944 may have been letting the enemy believe in him so completely that they could not see the truth arriving on the beaches of Normandy. When Patton was finally unleashed in August 1944, given command of the newly activated Third Army, The result was one of the most spectacular advances in modern military history. In just 2 weeks, his forces swept across France at a pace that stunned allies and enemies alike, liberating towns, crossing rivers, encircling German units before they could react. By late August, the Third Army had advanced further and faster than any force in the European theater. Patton was furious only when he was stopped, which happened with grinding regularity, because the Allied supply chain could not keep up with his ambition. He pleaded for fuel, for ammunition, for permission to keep moving east. He believed, and many historians have since agreed, that had he been given the resources and the freedom to advance through the fall of 1944, the war in Europe might have ended months earlier. Instead, resources were redirected northward to support Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's ill-fated Operation Market Garden in September 1944, a decision that haunted the final months of the war. If this story is gripping you the way great history always does, now is the perfect moment to subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with a friend who should be watching this, and tell us in the comments what surprised you most, because we are only halfway through, and the most consequential chapter is still ahead. The winter of 1944 brought the German counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge, launched on December 16, 1944, through the Ardennes Forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack shocked Allied command. American units were surrounded, outgunned, and fighting in brutal cold that killed nearly as efficiently as the enemy. The 101st Airborne Division was encircled at Bastogne. The situation was desperate. It was at this moment, in a command conference on December 19, 1944, that Patton produced what is widely regarded as one of the most astonishing military promises in history. When asked how quickly he could turn his Third Army, an enormous force in full motion along a different axis, northward to relieve Bastogne, Patton said 48 hours. The room went silent. Generals stared. Eisenhower himself seemed uncertain whether Patton was being serious or grandiose. Patton was serious. And on December 26, 1944, his forces broke through to Bastogne, exactly as promised, saving the encircled garrison and beginning the reversal of the German offensive. It was the moment that cemented his legend, and it was also, in many ways, the beginning of the end. As the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, Patton's vision of what should happen next increasingly collided with the political reality being shaped in Washington, London, and Moscow. He wanted to drive east. He wanted to take Prague. He wanted to confront Soviet forces, which he viewed not as allies but as the next inevitable enemy. He said these things loudly, privately, and with a consistency that alarmed everyone around him. At dinner tables, in briefings, in casual conversations with officers and journalists, Patton spoke of the Soviets with open contempt and of future conflict with them as a near certainty. He argued that the West would have to fight them eventually and that the moment to do so was now, while American and British armies were still mobilized, before the Soviet Union could consolidate its hold over Eastern Europe. These were not whispered doubts. They were declarations. And they reached the ears of people who had the power to act on them. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, a date that became known as Victory in Europe Day or VE Day. The celebrations had barely subsided when Patton's next crisis began. In his new role as military governor of Bavaria, Patton was responsible for the administration of a defeated German population, which included the deeply sensitive task of denazification, the systematic removal of former Nazi Party members from positions of authority. Patton handled this responsibility with a recklessness that was breathtaking even by his own extraordinary standards. He dragged his feet on removing former Nazis from administrative roles, arguing that experienced local administrators were necessary to prevent chaos, and that the whole denazification effort was, in his words, no different than a political fight between Republicans and Democrats. He said this publicly. He said it at a press conference on September 22, 1945. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Newspapers across the United States condemned him. Veterans organizations demanded his removal. The pressure on Eisenhower, now theater commander, became impossible to ignore. It was at this precise moment that Dwight D. Eisenhower made the decision that would define the final chapter of George Patton's military life. On October 2, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army and reassigned him to command the 15th Army, a force that existed largely on paper, assigned to the administrative task of writing the history of the European campaign. For a man who had led the most dramatic armored advance in American military history, it was a humiliation dressed in the language of reassignment. Patton accepted it with the bitter composure of a man who knew the game was over. He wrote in his diary that he was finished, that the politicians had won, that men like him were used in war and discarded in peace. He began speaking openly about resigning his commission, returning to civilian life, perhaps even speaking out publicly against the policies he despised. Those around him could feel the end approaching, they just did not know what form it would take. Harry S. Truman, who had assumed the presidency on April 12, 1945, following the death of Franklin Roosevelt, watched all of this with the cold, clear eyes of a man who had no illusions about what military officers owed civilian authority. Truman had served as an artillery officer in World War I. He respected military service with the intimacy of personal experience. But he also believed, with constitutional precision, that civilian control of the military was not a suggestion, it was the bedrock of American democracy. When reporters asked Truman about the Patton situation, he was measured but unmistakable. He supported Eisenhower's decision. He believed the denazification policy had to be followed, and that no general, regardless of his battlefield glory, stood above the policies of the elected government. What Truman said in those days was not a condemnation of Patton the warrior, it was a definition of what America stood for, a declaration that the Republic did not belong to its heroes, but that its heroes belonged to it. On December 9, 1945, George Smith Patton Jr. was involved in a traffic accident near Mannheim, Germany. He suffered a severe spinal injury and was paralyzed. He died 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, never having returned to American soil. He was buried among the soldiers of the Third Army in Luxembourg, a warrior whose end, like his life, was unlike anything ordinary. If this story moved you, if it made you see history differently, then do one thing right now. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one, like this video to help more people find it, share it with someone who needs to understand what real leadership truly costs, and leave a comment below telling us what you discovered today that you had never known before, because history is not just the past, it is the mirror in which we see everything we are still becoming.